Hello, I'm Debbie Freedman, and on behalf of Tacoma Historical Society, I would like to welcome you to our program on credit unions, looking at Tacoma's oldest financial institutions. We're filming today from outside my home, which this time of year we call Wisteria Way, and I hope you enjoy our program. When we think about credit unions, one of the first topics we look at the history is a man named Edward Filene, who is known as the father of U.S. credit unions. Now, when I think of Filene's, I think of the department store, Filene's Bargain Basement. But Edward Filene and his brother managed the store run that was started by his father. He became interested in a kind of banking that in Europe was a cooperative banking known as People's Bank. And he worked with the folks in Massachusetts to get legislation passed so that we can operate credit unions in the United States. And he liked the idea that the word credit union, the two words together, represented being able to borrow money to get reasonable loans, so avoiding those loan shark guys, and also talking about the connection between an employer and an employee. So that is where the term credit union comes from, and the father of U.S. credit unions is recognized as Edward Filene. Now, he did come to the Northwest, and he worked with us to try to get credit unions started in the Northwest in the 20s. Tacoma's senator, actually Ralph Metcalfe, introduced legislation in 1925. A revised version was tried after that. Edward Filene came to Tacoma, but both bills were vetoed by the governor. So it really took a few years later until the country was in the heart of a depression before we could get credit unions here in Washington. And that's because of that guy, President Roosevelt. Many of you remember hearing and learning about his New Deal. Well, this is that New Deal demonstrated in a little bit different way. It's a cartoon I found that ran in the Tacoma News Tribune in 1933, shortly after Roosevelt was inaugurated. And it described that New Deal as 5 cards that were being dealt as part of this package. And one of the beauties of doing this on video is that you can pause it if you want to spend more time looking at it. And the first card is banking. And on the day that Roosevelt was inaugurated, he had legislation ready to go to start what we call banking holidays to stop the runs on banks. But as part of that, legislation came forward that authorized credit unions. The second card in his deal was getting the budget under control. The third was decriminalizing or legalizing beer. So by opening breweries, not only do we help with morale, we improve the economy because we have jobs and we have revenue from the taxes on the beer. The fourth card was farm relief, so that banks were not taking land away from farmers who were growing our food. And the fifth card in that deal was unemployment. And that's what many of us think of when we think of the Depression and government programs, the WPA programs, to provide jobs much needed at that time. So this new legislation, how is a credit union different from a bank? Well, I'm not an expert, but what I understand is the big difference is that credit unions are operated as not-for-profit. So they're not going to pay taxes, but they're also not operating in order to make money. They're operating as a benefit for members who operate the bank as a member cooperative. And those members share some sort of common bond. And initially that bond was the employer. Well, the things that make a credit union separate and unique from a bank also provided me some challenges in my research. And permit me if I whine a little bit, but the way I did the research for the banking exhibit was to go through city directories, hundreds of volumes of city directories looking at the listings for the banks year after year and how they changed. Well, because of the credit unions were maybe an office within a factory, they didn't have a separate city directory listing. And because they're membership-based and nonprofit, it would really be unusual for a credit union to advertise in the early days. So the main communication system we had, the newspapers, I couldn't find ads for city directories. So there I am, my two big sources, city directories and newspapers, not working for credit unions. We also look at how we search and research. Today, we look at websites and databases. Well, credit unions could have their charter under a federal authority or under a state authority. So when I finally got help from the Pierce County Credit Union Group and got connected with a woman in the state organization, she wasn't able to help me with the credit unions that were affiliated federally. So it's still an ongoing process to learn more about these. The other thing is that computers are very unforgiving of spelling. And I learned that up until just a few decades ago, the word employee was spelled with only one E at the end. So I had to remember and learn to do both. The other challenge is that as the fields of membership expanded, those changes were reflected in the names. And so some of the names of the credit unions got quite long, and I was never certain exactly when it changed from Tacoma to Pierce County, or if there was a change in the way it went. So I had to learn when those happened. And also those long names led to some really creative uses of acronyms, but I kind of turned that into a benefit because I enjoyed that challenge. So those same benefits of credit unions, probably the biggest one that, from my opinion, from my viewpoint, was that credit unions worked together. Often they cooperated with each other and they belonged to county and state organizations. And so while an individual credit union might not feel the need to advertise, I learned and I saw that in the fall, there would be a credit union month, a credit union day, often in October. You can tell from this ad, we might be in kind of a Beatles era. But I discovered that our newspapers did have ads that would promote the organization as a county as a whole, and it would list individual credit unions. And that's where I discovered credit unions that I never would have known about before, because there was no other easily recognized source to find them. I also learned that because credit unions were conservative, a limited membership, fairly small loans, that the majority did survive for decades. They had great stability. And when I did see newspaper articles come in, it was often on an occasion of an anniversary, a 25th or a 40th anniversary of a credit union. And for me, one of the fascinating and exciting challenges of learning about Tacoma's credit unions is that their growth and development really paralleled the industries in Tacoma. And so by looking at credit unions, we are really looking at Tacoma's history. And also just taking a quick peek at how regulations have changed, it helps us see a little bit of the scope of credit unions. So when I read that in 1959, the loan periods were increased from 3 years to 5, that makes sense, but the maximum loan amount was increased from $400 to $750. So that told me that credit unions were making average maximum loans of under $1,000. Of course, that wasn't a time when you could buy a car for that. But again, it was a very small business. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar business in the early days. By 1976, we saw a major change with the introduction of a kind of a checking account. And in credit unions, it was first called share draft accounts, that you could take a draft on your share or your membership, the monies you had deposited. And that told me that credit unions were making small loans, and they were ways for people to invest their savings, but they likely weren't paying their day-to-day bills. They weren't writing checks through their credit unions. Of course, also during that time period, a lot of our bill paying was done in cash. So by 1982, we saw loosened requirements for membership. So not only the person who was employed, but their family members or people in their household. And then gradually that was extended to geographic area, anyone who lived in Tacoma, anyone who lived in Pierce County. And the beauty of that was that allowed for friendly mergers. And as factories closed, the credit union members could work together and still continue their credit union membership. And in the late 90s, we saw some major changes in the authorities of those common bonds. And that allowed credit unions to take on entire school districts. And I'm told that for credit unions, that was a big change. So the burning question: which credit union was first? Which credit union is the oldest? Well, technically, the first credit unions in Washington were organized by federal postal workers. So they could do that before the legislation that allowed in Tacoma. So in 1925, we had postal workers credit unions in Washington. So when you look at 1937 in Tacoma, the Postal Employees Credit Union was the largest because it had been around the longest. What was exciting for me to learn that was in 1937, there were 18 credit unions operating in Pierce County. And again, I learned that through one of these newspaper ads. Well, if you look at banking at that time, from the time of the Depression to the time of the early 60s, banking in Tacoma was kind of frozen. The same 6 or 7 banks operated for decades without change. Part of that was because the state and federal authorities were very reluctant to issue any new charters. So during that time period, we saw growth in credit unions while banks were kind of frozen. Well, what happened to the Tacoma Postal Employees Credit Union? It took a little detective work, but I learned that they eventually merged into the Seattle group. The name's changed over the years, and it is still part of Community First Credit Union. So we do still have a credit union in Tacoma that serves postal employees, but it is no longer Tacoma. So it's not the oldest. So who is first in Tacoma? Well, the Tacoma Teachers Credit Union was chartered in 1933 and for decades claimed to be the first in the state. They were organized in 32. Pretty early, even before that federal legislation was enacted. The credit union for teachers logically started in the basement of Stadium High School by just a handful of employees. And later, as the membership expanded from not just teachers, but all employees who keep a school going, the name was changed to the Educational Employees Credit Union. And in 1976, that credit union opened a substantial new building by TCC on South 12th and Pearl. Unusual architecture built in the shape of a cross with earth berm structures. In the 90s, that name was changed to Rainier Pacific. Unfortunately, that credit union failed in 2010. And the whys would be a whole nother talk by someone who knows a lot more about it than I do. But those assets were assumed by Umpqua Bank. So that credit union building is still there, but it is now a bank, not the oldest credit union anymore. So who's oldest now? That would be the City Credit Union, founded on June 4th, 1934. The first office was under the stairs of Tacoma's what's now Old City Hall, and it was municipal employees who gathered together. And again, it expanded from Tacoma to Pierce County. And I would imagine that the people who answered the telephone were quite happy when they could say, TAPCO Credit Union, may I help you? Much more abbreviated than Tacoma Pierce County Employees Credit Union. While we were researching this exhibit and planning, we were fortunate to work with John Bechtold, who for years led TAPCO Credit Union. And he was quite proud of the accomplishment that TAPCO was the first credit union in Washington State to offer online banking. He remembers that they had to charter an outside service to do that, but is quite proud that TAPCO was the first credit union to offer online banking in Washington State. And today, TAPCO membership is open to all Washington residents. Well, June 4th was what is now TAPCO. June 19th, just 2 weeks later, were the Hunt and Mate Employees Credit Union, so that industrial hardware, and also the Ledger Tribune employees. And the newspaper has had a union for many years, a credit union also. So that common bond is employment. And again, I love that those factories all organize their own. You know, I was thinking about it. There also was an industrial league baseball team. And many of these same factories and industries had their own baseball leagues. And I wonder if the commonality there also inspired credit unions. Here's a list of just some of the many credit unions operating in Tacoma that were related to industries or factories, whether it was manufacturing candy, whether it was brewery, whether it's a dairy, a plywood industry, or of course in Tacoma, shipbuilding. Some of the ones at the end of the list were fascinating to me. Something called TAM Engineering. Titus and McKay was a company that was formed during the shortages of World War II to rebuild engines and carburetors. The same shortage in World War II of newsprint led to the formation of West Tacoma Newsprint, and newspapers on the West Coast banded together, opened their own factory to generate the newsprint that they badly needed so that they could stay in business printing newspapers. One of the oldest of our industrial style credit unions was formed by the workers of the smelter. And of course it was smelter men. I don't think you'd find women there. In 1951, workers of the Tacoma smelter organized a federal credit union. And in 1958, they were quite proud to open the first credit union building that was dedicated just to the credit union, a standalone building. And as you're coming up the hill from Point Ruston, you can see that building on the right on North 51st. We know that the Tacoma Sarco plant closed in 1985, but the credit union continues as Tacoma Narrows Federal Credit Union. They were kind enough to loan some of their old equipment to us for the exhibit. And when I went in, I had looked at some pictures of them signing the contract to build the building. And the table that they were sitting at is still a table that's being used in the credit union office today. So a fascinating part of our history, the Smeltermen's Credit Union still operating, still in the building, still with some of the same furniture. And of course, the union and credit union. Tacoma and Pierce County has a very rich history of labor, organized labor. And so just like we have many, many unions for carpenters and electricians, truck drivers, machinists, food workers, many of those unions also opened and started their own credit unions, and they were often in an office within the union hall. In the exhibit, we have a journal that is the original book from the Tacoma Longshoremen Credit Union, and they open it once a month to add a new page for the transaction for that month, but it goes all the way back to their original charter and their original organization. Tacoma Pierce County also, of course, has a strong military influence. So you'll find that acronym ALVA is the American Lake Veterans Administration. In the 40s, in the 50s, there was a credit union for the members of the National Guard. Fort Lewis, McCord, of course, is the Harborstone Credit Union. So still an active cluster of credit unions in Tacoma Pierce County serving our many, many military members. As we progress to the 70s, we find that credit unions not only represent employers from a particular company, but they began to represent communities. And Seattle's Sentinel and AACP operated a credit union in Hilltop in the 70s. Unfortunately, when it failed, it made history as the largest credit union failure in the state. That left a real bitter feeling for a while, and the Tacoma Ministerial Alliance Credit Union stepped in to fill that void, and that operated in Hilltop until it was absorbed into TAPCO. And in the 90s, we made history again with the formation of the Korean Society Credit Union. And this was the first credit union in Washington State that served an ethnic group as its field of membership. And in 1991, that became part of Twin County Credit Union. So one of the last credit unions we're going to look at is a company or a credit union called Tacoma Telco, founded in 1940. Well, the employees who formed it worked for Tacoma Telephone and telegraph employees. And we know that in that time period, telegraph was an important part of our communication system. Their history tells us that early business was conducted by something that they describe as desk drawer and briefcase. And I think that's a very descriptive phrase, that it wasn't even a standalone office, but one person who might be an officer of the credit union would keep records in a desk drawer, would meet through briefcase, a very personal and intimate kind of operating. By 1959, Tacoma Telco opened its own office building on Fawcett Avenue at 744. That building's still there. And 20 years later, built on Broadway Plaza. The name again changes, so it actually didn't become Telco until 1993. And in 2001, The name was changed to Sound Credit Union. And that name really reflects a change in Telco, because over those past several decades, Telco had been absorbing several other credit unions, smaller credit unions, often when their employer changed or perhaps the business is closed. So we look at Karsten's and High Grade. The workers of the Good Samaritan Hospital had the Daffodil Federal Credit Union. We look at Plywood, Newsprint. And of course, we know that there were changes in the Ledger Tribune management in the 1980s. Sound Credit Union made history again in Washington a year ago when they finalized the acquisition of the Bank of Washington's assets. So they didn't actually become a bank, but they bought the assets of a bank. So we've grown from a small organization with a couple of files in a desk drawer to a huge credit union that can acquire the assets of a bank. Pretty incredible growth. Well, I told you that one of my challenges was acronyms. So I've listed some of them here that I've enjoyed trying to decode. And after you look at it a bit, it starts to make sense. But the experience with that, if you've listened carefully, we've already talked about ALVA and TAPCO and Telco, some of those. But there's some others that intrigued me and took some time to figure out. Don't worry, I've got answers. Well, I have answers for most of them. Number 11, we don't know yet. It was called TAG, T-A-G. Today, that's the Tacoma Actors Guild. But what was it, a Tacoma area something? I don't know. So if any of you have connections with a TAG credit union or memories, let us know. Some of them I just enjoy pronouncing. Number 12, Wanagasco. And when I look at it and think about it, of course, that's the Washington Natural Gas Company, of course. And Wednopa took me a while to realize that it was the Western District of the Northern Pacific. And again, that West Tacoma newsprint. And I didn't mention it, but if you're driving around Chambers Creek on the north edge of Steilacoom, what is now an abandoned factory and all you see is chain link fence, that fenced in off area is where the West Tacoma newsprint was on Chambers Creek. So if you're really excited about credit unions and want to learn more, we're quite proud that on our website, tacomahistory.org, we've shared research from many of our exhibits. So there's a chronology of candy companies in Tacoma, a chronology of photographers, and now with this Bank on Tacoma exhibit, we have a chronology of banks, of credit unions, and there's also a PowerPoint of looking back at buildings. It's kind of a walk down downtown Tacoma. Information is available at tacomahistory.org. Click on the tab at top that says research, follow down to original research, and you'll see those chronologies there. Now, if this was an in-person presentation, this is where I would say thank you and ask if you have any questions. And then there's an awkward silence until finally someone speaks up. Well, I've discovered there are a couple of questions that people always ask me. And the first one is, why banking? Why credit unions? Pardon me, but doesn't sound like the kind of thing that might be the most exciting topic. There are several reasons for doing that. Primarily, Tacoma Historical Society is fortunate to have many artifacts from the former Puget Sound Bank. And when that collection came in, it was like, wow, we've got to do something with this. This really tells a good story. We also have several members of the society who are former employees of credit union or of banks who are interested in being part of that. So that is essential in getting an exhibit up and running. The other thing is that I had looked a little bit at the 1893 banking panic before, when we did the Rising Up from Disasters and Defeat book on the 21 Tales series. And also when I was researching the Jewish community in the 1880s and 1890s. And I was intrigued by the tremendous impact of 1893. I also was curious about a statement that the historian Murray Morgan made when he said that going into the panic, we had 21 banks and coming out, we had 4. And the former library person in me just wanted to try to document that and see how many I could track and if I could match that now that I have tools that Murray Morgan didn't have. And you'll see on our banking chronology, we have 175 bank names, and there were well over 21 banks operating in Tacoma in the 1890s. We also have over 130 credit unions. So the second question I always get is, what's next? What's coming up next at Tacoma Historical Society? What exhibits are we working on now? I believe that the next exhibit will have something to do with the history of music in Tacoma. Kim Davenport, our communications direct manager, has been working on a new 21 Tales book looking at Tacoma's musical history, and we hope to incorporate that in some way into an exhibit. Personally, I'm off on a brand new research topic. I am determined to discover what happened to the members of the Committee of 15 and the 27 who were indicted in those dark times in Tacoma's history with the anti-Chinese movement in 1885. And I'm doing detailed genealogy and biographical research on them to find out what were they thinking. So again, thank you for joining us for this program and part of Tacoma Historical Society's speaker series. I hope that soon you can come visit us at 919 Pacific Avenue or wherever we might be.